Welcome everyone to another episode of Pathways to Insight. As usual, I have the lovely Mary. Hi, Mary.
Hi, everyone.
How are you doing today, Mary?
Really good. Managed a couple of crises and then, so I feel successful after that.
Good. A successful day. But we've also got Earl with us. Hi, Earl. How you going?
Hi there, everyone. I'm good. Yeah, I'm going okay for an afternoon. I think I'm okay. I survived the day.
That's good. Survival and success. Great.
That's the spirit.
So for those that don't know Earl, we've been working together for quite some time. I can definitely say that he's taught me a lot about this industry, working alongside him. I think I remember one of my first ever clients that I had was a client that we mutually held with Huntington's. Extremely complex, the level of detail. So I'm excited to have you on to talk and share your story. So today, I guess what we were hoping to do is learn a little bit about your motivations, a little bit about you, what brought you into this sector, and share some, any insights you may have for anyone listening about this space, really. So I guess to kick it off, my first question is, who is Earl? What brought you into this space? And yeah, we'll start it off there.
Okay, well, look, I guess in the scheme of things, I'm probably one of the older people in the sector, I guess, in business. I'm in my 60s already, and I entered this sector fairly late in my work career. I entered the sector in 2017, formally, but my background, I guess, in terms of me, is I guess I'll start off with my studies. I won't go all the way back to my nappy days, but
you can go as far as you want.
But yeah, look, I studied IT, computing science degree, probably because I had a little bit of I guess a bit of a knack for data and always liked data and logic and things like that, and that made sense at the time. But I guess back at the time, which was around 1980, 81, there wasn't really much in the way of modern day technology out there. When I started university, they were still using punch card machines. Probably most people listening to this probably don't even know what a punch card machine is.
No, I had to think about what that was.
Using very old stuff. We learnt some really sort of real old stuff with technology. People didn't have personal computers back then. They were just starting to get computers. So yeah, that was fun at uni. And leaving university, you're sort of programmed in very old languages that don't really exist much anymore. And I never really worked. I worked for one company, a small company, but then ended up going into my own business pretty much early on in tech. So my own business being maybe with a business partner or two. So we had a software development business. We'd write all sorts of interesting software for some, I guess, things that are not things that you'd normally think about. So I remember writing some horse racing software and working in that industry for a little bit, not working for the industry, but that was just sort of one of my, I guess, one of the things I focused on. It's something just happened to lead me down that pathway. And then sort of a little bit later, we were doing training. We ran training and Microsoft Office back in the early days. We'd build tools in Excel and build templates in Word and do all sorts of fancy stuff there. And then when it came to, I think, close to pretty much just after 2000, the year 2000, we ended up doing stuff with mobility, with handheld devices, and the old devices before they had phones built in. Some people might remember the Palm Pilot. So we built systems for Palm Pilot, ordering systems, and then BlackBerry came along, which was very popular in the early 2000s, and we ended up being one of the early Australian pioneers in BlackBerry solutions. We had a piece of software that was very popular, and so that led us into other sorts of solutions, and we ended up building a solution or delivering a solution for golf, mobile golf scoring. And we used to do a lot of corporate events, and we even ran some scoring at a professional event or two. And yeah, so did some interesting things in terms of tech, and enjoyed pretty much going through fax machines, new, email, when those things really were just getting started, and the early spreadsheets, and sort of looking back, it feels like a bit of a museum of going through the history of tech. But I know back before I even started, there was also older stuff. But yeah, it was really interesting seeing tech change over that period to
So
date.
you've done a bunch of different things, and I know we've spoken about it off I don't know, off air. Is that right, Mary? I think that's the correct terminology. Off air.
I think
I
that's
don't
what
even
you
know.
call it.
We're professionals now. But what I guess I know I've heard this story as well, but for those that don't know, what drew you into this sector? Because I mean, you've been obviously successful in building solutions from a software perspective, creating or solving problems outside of this industry. But what drew you here? Like, what drew you into
Sorry, and
this sector?
and I didn't. I probably didn't. I segued off as I often do, but I focused on my education and training. But in 1991, my daughter, my first child, was born, Jessie, and she was born shortly after birth. At about 5 months, she was diagnosed with a very severe neurodegenerative condition, which comes under an umbrella of conditions known as leukodystrophies, which are conditions that affect the central nervous system and effectively impact the nerves in doing their job. And her particular condition was very severe, so she never ever sat up, she never talked, or she never crawled, never rolled over, could never lift her head up as a baby, and so never crawled, walked, etc., talked. As I said, her diagnosis was at about 5.5 months, at which point my wife and I were advised that she would not live past 2 years old.
Oh, wow.
2 years of age, and that we should expect some pretty horrendous things to happen to her, that she'd go blind, that her swallowing reflex would go, and that she'd choke on her saliva and aspirate and basically die a pretty awful death.
What was that like? If you don't mind me asking, that would have been a big moment. You're going through, just your child is born, and got all and then now the hospitals and doctors and specialists are telling you, this news. What was that like for you and your family?
Well, it was like you can recall those sorts of episodes in your life, I guess, when someone has a horrendous period of life like that, you recall. And actually, when we had a pre-diagnosis, and we're told it's likely to be this, but we have to wait for the formal results. So my wife Deb and I were sort of sitting on this pre-diagnosis of concern for probably a couple of weeks, before we could go in and have formal tests in the hospital, the MRIs or the CT, that sort of level of test. And we sat on that without telling our families, and that was actually very difficult for us to sort of just be internalizing and dealing with that without telling our families. My mother had already had a very bad breast cancer at that point, so dealing with all of that. She was in her 40s at that point, my mother. So yeah, we were dealing with a lot of that sort of stuff. And then we went to the hospital and had the actual day where they did the tests, and it was a very stark process, very, very raw process. We were basically in a day ward. There was really only just us in there, my wife, myself, and my daughter Jessie, and a couple of specialists there, and a registrar. And they did the tests and basically said, yes, this is what it is. the registrar really was sort of in there practicing on us, as often registrars do. They're in their training and was sort of saying things to us and saying, how did that sound? And that he was really sort of early on in his training, and he didn't mean it in that way, but he was actually asking us if he was speaking to us the right way and we were taking his conversation the right way. But he didn't divulge the information. At that point, we sat down with a neurologist in the office there, and a very experienced neurologist, and I can't remember if there was a nurse or a social worker, but there was someone else with him, and that registrar, and he was just very blunt. He gave us that detail that I mentioned earlier about my daughter's life expectancy. There was no bedside manner. The neurologist was very old school, if that makes sense. It was just very straight up and down. There was no emotion or emotional support in the conversation. It was just, this is what you're going to deal with. Have you got any questions? If you have no questions, you can stay in here for a bit longer. We'll leave you now, leave you both there. You can just stay in this room. And that was it. It was just like black and white and quick and blunt. And that was it. So that was like a sledgehammer, even though we had the pre prep for it. It was just, I guess, that it was given to us in a very harsh way.
Was there any access to supports at that time? Were they offering any? Because I mean, I would assume that, well, the NDIS wasn't around, but
No,
what did they offer?
not in the 1990s. So that was 1991, late 1990. Actually, no. My daughter was born in late 1991, so this was 5 months later. So it was around, March, April, say April. I don't recall that there was any social work follow-up or offer at that point. I don't recall that. Sort of in the hospital, but we would then, I suppose at that point there was the allied health, the community allied health that we were handed over to. And allied health was very good. They were really good, our local health district, community, I guess whatever levels, whether they were nurses or physios or occupational therapists, etc. The people there were good, and we had lots of people reaching out. We'd be going in to lots of clinics, and we had lots of people coming into our house and doing physio and all sorts of different things, because back then look, I guess approaches now, clinical approaches now might be a bit different, even though there's no cure for my daughter's case. Things now are a little bit different. But yeah, we definitely had to be a bit creative in things that we tried and did. We had to decide whether we would try certain things or not, because we really had a short-term death sentence given to us. So, you'd exercise. We'd exercise our daughter on a standing frame, and she would be crying in pain because she'd never stood up before, and you'd have to buckle her all up, and she had all sorts of AFOs, devices. Did I say that correct, Mary? AFOs, from memory. I think that's what I can't remember what AFO stands for, but it's a device, piece of equipment that you might, maybe like a splint or things like that.
Oh, not my area. I have no idea.
I'm sorry. See, there's a silly assumption. Your allied health.
No, yeah. I'm just the mental health side of things.
Sorry. But yeah, I think they're devices, so there could be splints or any sorts of supports. And back then they were pretty much very basic, buckles and all sorts of things that are very different to now, the tech they use now. So yeah, we had to sometimes make decisions on whether we wanted to try things or not, given the trade-off with what the timings on things and what we were to expect. And Jessie was in and out of hospital a lot, with lots of complications. She was in pain a lot and crying, and you don't know when she can't talk to you. You don't know what the pain is. So yeah, lots of challenges, and I can go on forever with giving you that. I'm not going to go on forever, but
What was
No,
it
so
like once you kind of passed that initial kind of time frame that the doctors had? Like, what was that like for your family?
So look, they kept recalibrating. So when Jessie hit the 2-year mark, because they gave us that 2-year milestone, from 5 months to 2 years max. And yes, having said that, we were in and out of hospital with lots of different, chest infections and things like that. So when she got to 2, the neurologist said, well, 3, she'll live till 3 probably, and so then, we got to 3, and yes, there were lots of near misses and risks and all sorts of hospitalizations. And I think they probably said, I recall, she'll live till 5. And as an example, her optic nerve was supposed to deteriorate to the point where she'd go completely blind. Again, these are all to do with the nervous system. The nerves are controlling all parts of your body. And so we used to go and see an eye specialist, and the eye specialist would say, yeah, look, that eye is deteriorating. This one looks like it hasn't changed much. And we go every 6 months. And after about, I think, 2 or 3 years, we just decided, what's the point in us going? Because they just keep telling us this is deteriorating, that's deteriorating. My daughter can't tell us what she can see. She can sense things. We had, she colored lights and things like that. She could probably see. We thought she could see it in us as a blur. And we knew that her hearing was compensating. So we just decided after a few years, for example, to stop seeing the eye specialist. So yeah, I think, Mary, to your answer, you just adjust, but they kept changing timeframes for us. So after we got to 5, she actually plateaued a little bit. She wasn't in hospital as much, and so that's when we started to feel a little bit better about, okay, well, look, we've pushed past some of those benchmarks, if you want to call it, not really a benchmark, but those sort of timelines. But we'd also seen 1 or 2 kids with the same condition pass away at similar ages. We didn't have really many people to go to. We'd only ever met 2 other children with that condition because it's so rare. But yeah, she sort of not stabilized, but she didn't deteriorate as quickly after she got to about 5 or 6. So yeah, at that point, we actually decided we might see if we can have another child. We decided we didn't want to have another child earlier because we wanted to focus on Jessie and just give all of our focus on her. So yeah, we decided at a certain age, we'd sort of move on with our lives, so to speak.
what was the hospital thinking during that time? Because I mean, that like they kept pushing out and readjusting, but at some point were they surprised? Were they like, was it you know what I'm saying? Because at the beginning
Yeah.
they were talking about.
Oh, look, I think the best way to explain it and to, I guess, understand where they were coming from is when you're talking about the 1990s, internet was not the way it is now, right? Information at your fingertips. The specialists, as I said, there were, I think, 2 other cases in Australia, or at least 2 other cases in Sydney that we're aware of. And so the specialists were just going on journals that you'd maybe pick up in a library or, a medical library or whatever. They couldn't just sort of pull down a file and find out, here's all these other cases with this condition overseas, and maybe lifespans are a bit different. So they were pretty much just going by anecdotal evidence from people who've died in the past and giving us that sort of information. Having said that, I mean, I know that we were, maybe I'll say lucky, in that Jess did outlive everyone that everything. If I sort of jump ahead, she's now, 34 years old, and she's way outlived at every expectation, at every stage that we've ever been through, and every problem we've ever had, and every near-death hospitalization where they've told us this is about to pass, because we did have those as well, where we were told a couple of days she might be in hospital in a serious way. So we just sort of got through those things, just however we got through them.
Do you know if there are other like people with leukodystrophy that are around Jess's age, or is she the only one?
So let me just clarify. So leukodystrophy is a group of conditions, and Jess's condition is a subset of that. So her condition is called Canavan disease, and there's probably about 50, at least 50 different conditions under the banner of leukodystrophy. So it's quite rare, I guess. The group of diseases is quite rare. You can name other conditions, and that's the condition, or that's the group, like multiple sclerosis or motor neuron disease. I know muscular dystrophy, which is not the same as leukodystrophy. Leuko is nerves and muscular is muscles. Muscular dystrophy, there are some different types of muscular dystrophy, but not 50 or more. So leukodystrophy has many different types. There's a condition, the most common one is called adrenoleukodystrophy. And there was a famous movie called Lorenzo's Oil that some people might have seen. And that was about a boy called Lorenzo with adrenoleukodystrophy. And that's a bit more common, definitely more common than Canavan. It still affects the central nervous system and the coating around your nerves, but it's a different sort of leukodystrophy. It's caused by a different enzyme. There's many different leukodystrophies, and even more, even now being diagnosed with genomics, now being able to identify intricacies of chromosomes and genes differentials.
And because I know from there you've essentially designed every portion of the care around Jessie, right? So
yeah, and just back to Mary's question. So back to Canavan, as I said, we only really ever met, I think, 2 families local to Sydney with children with Canavan disease, and we spoke to a few people interstate who had previously had children who had passed, but hadn't met anyone else living with Canavan disease actually since. And yeah, so that sort of answers that question. Leukodystrophies, there's probably 1,000 to 2,000 people with different types of leukodystrophies living in Australia. But again, there are all sorts of different conditions that have different progressions and starting points.
I would imagine it would feel like quite isolating, like considering that it's so rare and there aren't that many people that you can kind of speak to. Like, does the banner of leukodystrophy kind of help with that, and that you don't need to find someone with, the specific condition that your child has, but at least it's kind of like in the ballpark?
Yeah, look, very early on, and it was a coincidence, total coincidence. So it was in 1992. So it wasn't actually long after Jess was diagnosed. Someone reached out to me. She was a nun. Her name was Sister Julie Thomas, and she had formed this support group called the Australian Leukodystrophy Support Group in 1992 around August. And back then, I guess privacy was a little bit different, but she was given our name, probably from Australian Genetic Society or something like that. I can't remember, but was given our name as a family with a child with a leukodystrophy. And she reached out and said, we've got this new group, and if you need any help, we're here. We're a support group, and we're very much grassroots. And it was really her. She actually had an adult onset form of a leukodystrophy, and so she was probably in her 50s at that point and was starting to progress with her form of leukodystrophy. It was an adult, as I said, adult onset form, and she was great. She was, I guess, a trained counsellor. We didn't really need much counselling. She's just a person on the other end of the phone to speak to. But in a way, I guess that is counselling as well. And that group very much started, in a way, and allowed families to liaise and communicate with each other and reach out and support each other. So it was like this very early, raw, grassroots support group, probably one of the earliest of its type, I guess. So that did help. So we did meet families and speak to families, or parents of typically they were kids with Canavan, the 2 kids that I mentioned. but also other families with other forms of leukodystrophy. Again, back in those early days, we were mainly speaking to families who had children with a diagnosis, not many adults with an adult onset form. I sort of started to meet more of those later on when I got involved with that group more formally. I ended up being on the committee of that group. So yeah, that sort of support group was very important. And the other thing for me was, as internet was evolving, I was using the early search engines to really, luckily, I guess with my tech background, I was really inquiring and doing a lot and joining overseas support groups. And those support groups were using the very early internet, where you had to sort of dial up on a modem and connect that way. And but yeah, I did join support groups, and then we'd phone families overseas, because obviously there's a lot more people, say, in America or other countries. So those things are very important, speaking to other people with lived experience.
And I guess the speed of the internet now can bring people all over the world closer together, and kind of closing the gap on sharing information and so on. I look, for those that don't know, obviously you're now, because in the industry supporting people in the disability sector. I guess when did that start to take shape for you? So when did that personal journey start to, I guess, move into, we're going to now, because again, for those that don't know, you have an organization that you run, or two organizations. One is OnlyCare, which is, I guess, focusing on similar situations to Jesse in terms of complexity, not only obviously, but you do have a specialization in that area. And then also you have another organization called ConnectCare Australia, which is, again, more focused on the SEAL component side. And I'll let you, provide more detail. But when was that moment of crossover when, you were, bringing that sort of model of care, I guess, over to the sector?
Well, it goes back because with Jess, obviously with her needs and pretty much no progression from birth, or a very tiny progression and then deterioration, we use the old services. So again, we're talking about 1990s and then 2000s, and so we used a lot of the old services that existed in New South Wales under Aging, Disability and Home Care, so which is the acronym is ADIC. And so we used a lot of those services. In fact, it used to be called DADIC before then. But so we used a lot of services there. But I would say that most services back in those days were not geared up to deal with someone as severe as Jess. You didn't really see those people like Jess out in public. They were stuck behind closed doors. They might, I remember when Jess was in hospital, there was one patient there who didn't have a leukodystrophy, but she was hooked up to probably a ventilator or whatever, and she was just permanently in hospital. She was a teenager in the ward, and with tech and technology, I'm talking clinical hospital technology, medical technology is different now. But back in those days, a lot of people either didn't live because equipment just didn't support them, or they were just literally institutionalized, stuck in hospital. And so we were at home, and we were managing Jessie as well as we could. And so we used a lot of the services that were around at the time, but those services were more geared up to different sorts of disabilities, more of the milder, conditions. I'm not playing them down, but conditions where people were mobile and maybe running around and going to day programs, but they might have had intellectual disability or other sorts of disability, autism or Down syndrome, but maybe the kids were a bit more mobile, for example. You didn't really see the kids like Jess. And so the service that provide the carers, I think we used to call them back then, or the support workers that we call them now, didn't really have any skill in dealing with someone like Jess. Jessica needed to be suctioned. If she didn't get suctioned, she'd choke. And so, and she had a peg feed, a gastrostomy feed in her tummy. And again, you know, most of the carers back then didn't have that qualification or any sort of training at all. They were not trained in that way at all. So the issues that we hit were that as Jess really started to progress, and she did actually start to progress again when she turned 8, she almost died in hospital. And then pretty much just after my son was born. So everything was all stable. We decided to have a child, and then literally the week my son was born, Jess significantly deteriorated, and we were told she would pass, and my wife had just given birth, and it was just a pretty awful time. But back to the point, we had to sort of be creative and had to do a lot of the care ourselves because the staff were just not up to it. But over the years, we sort of had to create our own model of care. We were just lucky at one point that the agency that we were dealing with back at the time, and, you know, I guess we're talking about, you know, maybe around 2010 or thereabouts, maybe a bit before, actually sent us a staff member who actually was a nurse from South America. And she was over here on a student visa and looking for work. And I think she'd been looking for work as a cleaner. And we'd been saying to the agency, you know, you need to send us people who have nursing qualifications. And so this nurse happened to just walk into their door looking for a cleaning job because her English wasn't very good. And they said, we think we've got a client for you. And as soon as she came in, it was just like a breath of fresh air. Not that the other staff were not, that they were nice people, but, you know, we were running into trouble with managing Jess's feeding tube and suctioning and things like that. And suddenly it was like a light switch. So yeah, at which point we started to push for more staff like her, and they weren't easy to find. So yeah, in the end, we were able to self-manage under the old ADDIC system. You had to go through a lot of hoops and all sorts of barriers before you could prove that you could self-manage. And we were able to find a lot more people like her, like that nurse, not registered in Australia, but still had that background. And we pretty much created our own model of care. And most of our staff were actually ultimately ended up being overseas nurses, doctors, physios who were not registered here, who were here on student visas, but we effectively had like a mini hospital. Not that they were treating her, it was just they were managing her condition because they understood anatomy and they'd worked with patients with feeding tubes and stuff like that, you know. So yeah, we ended up creating our own model of care.
And how did that transition into OnlyCare?
Yeah. So how that transitioned was that I was doing a bit of advocacy, just voluntary advocacy for the leukodystrophy support group back then. And my daughter had a palliative care doctor. Back then, my daughter was classified as palliative. They expected her to pass near term. And our palliative care doctor reached out to me and said, look, I know someone who's stuck in hospital. He has muscular dystrophy and he's being pushed into aged care. He's in his early 50s. And I know that you've always fought for your daughter. I know that you know how to come up with alternative solutions. Do you think you could help to get him out of hospital? Because the hospital is pushing him into aged care and ADDIC is saying we're not going to fund him to come home. He went into hospital in a coma or in a very serious way. And his condition had deteriorated with his form of muscular dystrophy. So yeah, she asked me if I could go in and advocate. So I did. Managed to I don't know, just get things right, negotiated with the hospital, negotiated with ADDIC, and this was sort of a year before NDIS was due to hit this part of Sydney. We knew the NDIS was coming and just did a lot of negotiating and advised that we could create a creative model for him at his home that didn't involve, because they kept saying he needed nurses and, you know, the system won't pay for nurses. So I assured them that we could actually find the right sort of personnel. They weren't nurses here, but they had the skill set to be able to manage him at home. The hospital was really happy with that. We got ADDIC on side to fund things a little bit more, to maybe fund him until the NDIS was going to hit his part of Sydney. And we actually got, and this was all voluntary at that point. I actually had the help of that nurse I was telling you about. She volunteered to help me to find staff for him. And we basically put this model of care together. And the hospital actually made sure that they were all competent. They all came in and made sure that they knew how to hoist and do all the peg feeding and everything else that were needed for his particular similar sort of level of need. And then suddenly ADDIC turned around and said, sorry, he can't self-manage. You need to find a provider to deliver those supports. And so it just at that particular point in time, I was approached by someone who knew of his case, someone who was doing some things with muscular dystrophy in the charitable sector. And he had actually set up a new business, a home care business. And he reached out to me and said, look, I heard you're trying to get him home and that you need a provider. Well, I've just set up this home care business and I can maybe help. And so he, pro bono at cost, was able to put the staff in under his new business. And we were able to get him home, but he basically did it at cost, but on the basis that as soon as the NDIS came along, obviously if he could come on as a client, at least he wasn't effectively losing money. And at the same time, he actually asked me if I wanted to set up a disability agency under his sort of, in his business. So yeah, it took me about a year to agree. And then I switched career path from tech into disability. And that was it. That was 2017. That was sort of the early days of when NDIS pretty much hit Sydney. And we went from there.
And 9 years later, you're still here.
Yeah. In that year, while you were kind of thinking about it, was there anything that you were like that was kind of holding you back?
Look, there are a few things. I won't go into the detail of it because they're sort of business negotiations in terms of making sure that you had the right people around you. But I also had to extricate myself from my IT business. There were two businesses there, but the timing worked well, and it worked well. And I guess I just looked at the karma side of things. Now, my daughter had taught me all about disability, and that's why I always say when I look back now, my daughter's never spoken, but she's my biggest teacher. You know, she's taught me everything about disability, and not just about care at, I guess, at the high intensity side of disability, which was my skill, and my wife. But she taught me about patience, because I probably, like many people, I wasn't always patient, but she taught us so much about patience. And you know, we learnt a lot about what it's like to, I guess, be a family with someone with a very severe disability, and, you know, losing friends, and not losing friends, but, you know, losing people out of your comfort zone because, you know, you didn't fit in and you weren't accessible to them. So we learnt a lot about, not just about providing care, but how people think as loved ones and as people with disabilities. So, but the learning curve, the learning experience that my daughter has provided to me has completely not just changed my life in terms of business, but in terms of just complete thought and way of life and rationalizing things. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, that it took about 6 months to a year, and then it was like, okay, let's jump in.
And it looks like, you know, there were so many sort of points along that journey where just things just happened to kind of like come together, and it was just like almost like, you know, that skill plus a little bit of luck, and you know, look at this amazing kind of service that you're now providing to people. I just amazing to see how it's all come together.
And well, my daughter's longevity is the common thread there, you know, to be honest, because, you know, in 2017, so we're talking now it's 2026, so what are we talking, 9 years? So she was 25, I mean, she was already way out there in terms of someone living with her particular type of leukodystrophy. She was like, we already knew there were not many people with her particular condition around the world, even though that you don't get a lot of stats. We knew that she was already out there. So we're already pioneering things well and truly beyond what we expected. So her longevity really was the thing that really sort of got me into this space and has taught me so much. So yeah.
So 9 years later, obviously you've gone through your journey. You're now, president of the Leukodystrophy Australia, supporting many families that may have gone through similar journeys. I guess as a closing message to the community, if there is any, a parent, a carer, maybe a provider, or someone, really going through the thick of their particular situation, is there a message you would want to say to them, something that they can, take some support from?
Look, it's difficult in that many families when you have particularly a child, but it could be also an adult family member who's deteriorating later in, with an adult onset. It's a big crisis for a family, and unfortunately many families don't survive those situations. You see breakups and all sorts of things, so that's difficult. So whether or not a family is in that situation, I would say that it is difficult because you're dealing with, especially with early diagnosis, you're dealing with stuff happening from every direction. And sometimes if there is a support group or a peak body available with, social workers or people that might reach out to you, or maybe, to reach out to them, often, especially as I said early on in a crisis, you might just think, I've got too much on my plate. I don't have time. I don't know. I need to focus on the near-term matters. Or if someone's maybe living with this situation, they feel like they're on top of the situation. I would say, and often in that situation, people might say, oh, there's people worse off than me or us. We're sort of managing things. So there's two different scenarios there I've given you where people might not reach out for support to say a support group. I would say reach out, because there are maybe people worse off than you, or maybe they're not worse off than you, but if there are groups available that are geared up to support you, you will learn a lot, or if nothing else, you might be able to help others if you've got the capacity to help. So I think, don't ever think there's someone worse off than us. And if you're dealing with a situation where you feel like you're overwhelmed, still reach out, because there are good people out there and good organizations out there. And even if they can't help, the modern support systems out there can hopefully help.
What about a closing message to providers? Because I think I'm interested to see what advice you give them for any provider out there that's supporting a family going through this moment.
Look, the moment could, if we sort of generalize a little bit, the moment could relate to someone with a neurodegenerative condition or similar, or it could be someone who's dealing with a child or someone else, an adult in the family who's got extreme and challenging behavior through no fault of their own. It could be someone dealing with a Huntington's disease progression, or it could be someone with a child with a very severe form of autism, and same challenges for family members, just maybe different journeys, but same destination, I suppose, in terms of the challenges that you're facing, or maybe similar destination. So from a provider perspective, whether it's a client with physical disability or other types of disability, I think it's good to try to pick a lane that you want to specialize in. I mean, you can have more than one lane, and try to focus a little bit, at least. Again, you can have multiple focuses, but really try to understand either a group of conditions or a type of presentation that you can handle, because that will help you, obviously, to help that client or that participant with better qualified supports, or it will help linkers, support coordinators or other types of linking services to find a provider that has more skills to be able to support people with that particular type of condition.
Well, thank you, Earl, so much for today and for sharing your story. And hopefully people can find some comfort and hopefully find pathways to support like you're suggesting. So if anyone has any comments about today, please let us know, and we'll put Earl's contact details if you want to look into the OnlyCare service. All right, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everyone.